For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ann Stander. I've been privileged to work with the students of the foundation program at Nazarbayev University for the past 5 years. My research partner, Dr. Sarah Mani, is a professor of multilingual composition at Arizona Western College. She will not be joining us today as she is on a whirlwind tour of Europe. But I am indebted to her for her insights into the research design and approach to literature, and I'll continue to rely upon her greatly as the study moves forward. Allow me to spend the next 20 minutes describing the purpose of our research, some literature which informs the study, seeming gaps in which the study may be able to contribute, and the methodology developed so far. There are no results or conclusions yet, so I will finish my remarks with our limitations. Afterwards, I will be very pleased to hear your questions and suggestions. To review the context of our study, like everyone else in education during the pandemic, there were concerns in our program about how disconnected students would feel with the online course delivery, and if online tutorials would diminish the student-tutor relationship. However, unlike the experience found in current literature, in which most programs quickly transition to digital platforms, our EAP Foundation program was well positioned for a blended learning model, as it had already established a protocol for student writing and continuous formative feedback within a digital environment. The program's continuity and adjustments provide a unique opportunity to explore the relationship between tutor feedback and the task management strategies of undergraduate EAP students developing projects over a 5 to 6 month period. Within all of these years, the demands of the writing assignments remained stable in most respects. Students were expected to present a final research paper of 2,500 words for the main text. The major adjustment in the fall semester of 2020 was to drop the warm-up project, allowing for more time for the final assessment. Therefore, the research and writing tasks on one dedicated topic began 6 weeks earlier. Preliminary deadlines were added with an incurred penalty. So, the research questions guiding us are: what are students' general patterns of time and task dedication related to deadlines? How did this time and task dedication differ before, during, and after the pandemic? And what influence did tutor feedback have on students' task management strategies throughout the entire research period? I'll now guide you through a snapshot of the recent literature. This may be more than a snapshot than you're really delighted to look at today, but there are 4 areas I'll mention, which include the tutor's role in fostering task management strategies, EAP students' strategies in action during COVID, and as revealed by keystroke studies. I do ask your pardon for the first part. This is more theoretical and a little dry. After these 3 slides, things will loosen up. So, Leckie and Carson define task management strategies for research writing for EAP students into 3 categories: research needs, basically library skills and source evaluation skills; source management, referring to reading, summarizing, and avoiding plagiarism; and thirdly, managing the stages of their own composition. Research suggests 2 major mechanisms for tutors' role in developing students' task management: development of writing and cognitive skills, and addressing the students' affective needs. Educational psychologists such as Wilby connect an increased capacity in academic skills gained through the social persuasion of the feedback process to growth of the student's self-efficacy, which cultivates self-regulatory learning. The author defines this as succeeding academically through spurring one's own actions, thoughts, and moods. All the research I will refer to in this section on developing students' task management is based on graduate students because those are the studies where this process has been observed. So starting with the tutor skill development role, the graduate thesis writing mentorship, according to Starfield, is intended to socialize students into a community of practice. This involves delivery of feedback to engender more independence in the student. With multiple drafts, direct and do this or directive comments decrease, and indirect comments such as questions and underlines increase. Explanatory comments, which are, or referential remarks, which are rich in exploration, also increase. Grinnell, this is a certain Lena Grinnell of UC London, who some of us met this winter, in her 2023 dissertation, likewise emphasizes that best feedback practices scaffold students towards independence. She refers to Hannon Hyland, who consider as particularly effective a continuous formative feedback cycle with written feedback paired with the writing conference. Tutors ideally develop students' capacity to evaluate their own work, which will enable them to meet future expectations. This process has been termed feed forward. Winstone et al. View this process as cultivating feedback literacy. Tutors promote feedback literacy with comments that challenge students to be critical and reflective of their work. On the affective side, Grinnell discovered that praise and encouragement about performance were comments students valued most highly. Students rely on praise to buoy them through working through all of the critical remarks. We could call this the spoonful of sugar feedback practice. There are, however, some important pitfalls of this approach, which I don't have time to cover today. We're now moving away from what influence instructors may have on task management to observing students' strategies in action. From a psychological perspective, Wilby notes the limits of our influence as instructors in a foundation setting when faced with students' individual motivations. He describes how students with the joy of learning possess a mastery goal orientation. On the other hand, students with a performance goal orientation seek the best grade with the least amount of effort. Student differences in goal orientation drive their compositional strategies. Let's now turn back to graduate students for a fine example of successful task management in thesis writing. In Bravarian-Tan's study, the students reported that their successful processes fell under three main themes. I'm going to list them backwards, and I think you'll understand why. Number 3 was developing a productive dynamic with supervisors. Number 2 was not over-relying on their thesis supervisor for issues beyond the text. This meant taking workshops and getting other support for many of the skills like Ian Carson mentioned, such as researching, paraphrasing, and improving their language use. They also leaned on their friends and family as readers to improve the clarity of the text before they submitted it to their supervisors. And then their first group of strategies involved directing their own process, which included mood management, staying organized, and having consistent reading and writing habits. Now we'll move to the COVID context. Most research here focuses on the teacher's experience. An exception is a study by Xu, which considers the effects of online instruction on both the EAP students and their instructors. For their part, instructors made great efforts to extend the instructional space through longer tutorials, which mirrors what we did in our program. However, the teachers in the study had to convert suddenly to a digital feedback system. The authors found that students responded quite positively to feedback delivered online through the pandemic. They concluded that feedback aided student self-regulatory strategies and inspired them to improve their writing. Crucially, however, whether students engaged with feedback seems to depend on individual differences. All right, we're at the last section of the literature review. I'll conclude this with a glance at keystroke studies, even though what Sarah and I intend to do may not technically be a keystroke study. You may ask me about that later if you like. Gudrun Harwood's study used keystroke recording and a video replay with Think Aloud reflection of 5 graduate students. The study found 2 main task strategies. 3 students clearly displayed Wilby's self-regulated learning by planning, substantially revising their text as time allowed, and showing concern for making a positive impression on the reader. The other 2 students, one of whom plagiarized her essay, even knowing her actions were being video recorded, held to a get-it-done approach. The Think Aloud reflective interviews show that previous instruction had a strong influence on writing strategies. For example, students who learned essay writing through drills and strict models were likely to hold to those same strategies even when faced with new instruction. The final study I'll discuss today aimed to discover the influence of relative proficiency on writing strategies. Xu and Xia recorded the writing activity of nearly 100 students for a single writing session, of which they selected 2 students for analysis. They did not consider this to be a time-pressured test, as students generally used only 45 of 70 minutes allotted to them. Here are 2 graphs produced in their study. On the left, we see a writer who spent twice as much time planning her essay and at least 12 minutes revising and editing. This loop section here represents the revision activity. The student on the right spent no time in revision before concluding the session. Now, I'll have you guess which student received a better mark on this assessment. Yes, the student on the left. Special prize to Helen Gaske. Okay. Rather than a motivational difference, the authors felt that the relative proficiency level of the students was at work. They suggest that less proficient writers spend less time planning and revising their text. By cutting short the planning stage, they are more likely to depend on their working memory, succumbing more quickly to cognitive overload. This may be why they conclude the writing process with less revision and review than more confident L2 writers. And if you look at this line here, so the student stayed in the session for a couple minutes at the end without making any further changes, that you could consider the cognitive flat line. So, beyond the snapshot of literature I've just shared, my overall reading list has revealed some interesting gaps. Apart from a few semester-long studies, feedback practices are generally observed in graduate students. The undergraduates in semester-long studies worked on multiple separate essays and received only 1 round of formative feedback. Regarding changes wrought by the pandemic, we've seen pretty much the literature on teachers experiencing suddenly transition. With students, there's no comparison really between how they felt about feedback before, during, and after COVID. In terms of methodology, feedback studies have relied on surveys, interviews, think aloud protocols, and activity diaries. Before Grinnell's dissertation, which observed the work of 54 graduate students, the only feedback studies using text artifacts or the feedback comments themselves were case studies involving at most 2 graduate students. Finally, keystroke studies are new, and thus far in EAP have only captured a single writing session. In order to learn how much time students spend composing, when they compose, and to what extent their writing may be encouraged by comments from the tutors or even deadlines, I will process the writing session reports from the keystroke application that we use in our program. 5 or so tutors will be recruited. Then those tutor students will be recruited in order to access their data, their documents. It is hoped that 2 to 3 students in each for each tutor will be recruited in each year of the study. The writing session reports will be analyzed to locate patterns in time and task management among students, especially between those composing during the pandemic and those in the writing course before and afterward. Aggregate data may include total writing time, time of day, changes in writing sessions before the deadlines, and changes in activity related to tutor comments. The chart does not represent real data. This is an artistic rendition of what it might look like for one semester worth. The y-axis represents the duration of the writing session. We might find, for example, that students generally write in bursts of 20 minutes or less, with a break of 10 minutes on each side. That's what a writing session looks like. The x-axis shows dates, and the red lines represent the deadlines. We also intend to correlate the students' activity with dates on which tutors gave feedback. The qualitative data will consist of feedback comments in the participating students' projects. Only comments related to task and time management will be noted, such as praise, encouragement, deadline reminding, and prioritizing suggestions. The comments will be extracted, anonymized, and then randomized. So the commenter's authorial voices will be less evident. Then after it's all cleaned up, my co-author will be responsible for categorizing and coding the data. Only coding data will be revealed. No direct quotes will be retained. In cases where the nature of comments are frequently repeated across various tutors, a few example paraphrased comments may be derived. We realize there are many limitations, and I'm not going to go through a lot of this right now, but in this section alone, we will not be able to take into consideration the impact of the tutorials, and literature suggests that the tutorial is as or often more important than the written feedback itself. Also, we're not going to learn anything about the revision process, which is a pity. Although maybe with the time and task dedication, no, we're not going to get it, basically. Okay, so I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of several colleagues, not necessarily by name, but some of you have helped me field questions in preparation for this presentation, or especially some support in approaching IREC. Elaine Sharplin in particular was very generous with some coaching for approaching IREC. And I'll thank my in-house statistician, partially ahead of time, Mr. Eric Clymer. Thank all of you for your polite attention, and I look very much forward to your questions at this point.